Hello, I'm the Grub Street Lodger. My hair is big and a mess today. Let's chat books. So, the first book I read this month, or last month, which was September, was The Journey to the Mayflower, God's Outlaws and the Invention of Freedom by Stephen Tomkins. Now, I borrowed this book from my dad. I stayed round their house for most, if not all of August, much of August. And it was sitting there, and I thought, well, that looks kind of interesting. But that looks kind of interesting in a possibly slightly flat way. There is nothing flat about this book. It starts off with someone getting burnt, and it just goes on from there. As a history, it's a roller coaster. As a ecclesiastical history, a history of religion. I mean, this is the first paragraph. In August 1553, the Bishop of Gloucester and Worcester was summoned to London. The Privy Council told him he was in trouble over debt to the Crown of £509, 5 shillings and 5 pence in unpaid first fruits. But everyone knew the truth. The Queen wanted him burned alive. And she did, and it's disgusting, and he's trying to talk while his tongue is blackening up and smoke's coming out. And yeah, so we get all of this persecution of the Protestants under Mary I stuff. And there's stuff like Protestants escaping down the Thames using their shoes as paddles, and one guy getting locked in a noisious, bad-smelling dungeon, he describes it, where people just throw fireworks in at him now and again. Then comes Elizabeth I, and she's a Protestant, so you think, oh, things are going to get better. But she's a very conservative Protestant, and her Act of Uniformity is one that everyone thinks is a temporary act. So they think, well, that's not going to last. But it does, because she's queen for 40-odd years, which no one's really expecting at the time. They think, oh, she'll be deposed, or she'll get married, or the Spain will invade. And so this temporary act becomes the act for a long time. And so the Protestants who want more, and who think wearing robes is dumb, and they start having all these ideas about bishops, and how there are no bishops in the Bible, and things like this. They start thinking, at first they think we need to reform Church of England, but Church of England's not having any of it. So then they start thinking, we need to create our own churches. And so then there's this story of their persecution while they make their own churches. And then they all go to Holland, and in Holland they're not persecuted. And that's where it really goes wrong for them. Because they're called separatists. And you know what? Separatists, they got to separate. And separate they do again and again and again. At one point, one church turned into 5 different churches. One of which had one person in it. One of which became the Baptists, who then split into 4 different churches. One of those Baptist churches decided they didn't want to be Baptist anymore, tried to join some Dutch Anabaptists who wouldn't accept them, so they were a church that weren't a church. It was a shit show. And they got so fed up with this, they thought, let's go to another country and start our own promised land. And that country was America. And so that's why it's the road to the Mayflower. In fact, the congregation that went on the Mayflower, Robinson's congregation, they were the nicest ones. Some of the others were right bastards. They're like, you disagree with me about hats? Unbeliever, shun him. But these were the ones who were like, yeah, we're cool, we're fine. They were in Leiden, the university town, and they had a lot more contact with other people. And so they're a lot chiller. But they're the ones that ended up being on the Mayflower. And boy, did they fuck that up too. They got the Mayflower, and they got the Swiftsure. And the Swiftsure sank 3 times on the way out of England. So they just left it behind and all got in the Mayflower. And then they got lost. And then when they got there, they didn't have to run a town. Just a religious congregation, so they ran the town with a covenant, which is how they'd run their church, and it's sort of this very peculiar thing where you got Puritans who are very much not about individual freedoms. So I'm rubbing my leg because it's very tense. Individual freedoms, and out of it, this kind of idea of religious freedom, because they believe that to be a good Christian, you have to choose to be a Christian. And so that means there are people who can choose not to be. And so it was a really interesting book. You think, bunch of squabbling godbotherers, it's not going to be very good. But it was really, really exciting. Gets a little bit complicated in the middle, lots and lots of names, but also lots and lots of really funny anecdotes. My favourite was a man, I've forgotten his name now, who he was accused of biting a man's nose off in anger, but then he became a Protestant and he started preaching, and then he decided that he would be the king of Europe and that he would take over Europe, and then he decided he was the second coming, and then 2 days later he was hung, drawn and quartered. It's not supposed to be funny, being chopped up in horrible ways for your beliefs, but he was such an idiot. But yeah, I recommend it. That was the first book of September. Second book of September, I don't have a copy, but with the aid of fairy magic, there should be one around here somewhere on the screen. It is Lydia the Reading Fairy. You see, I've worked at school for 11 years, and these books have been around a little bit longer. They've been around 15 years or so. And do you know what? There's 240 of them, these fairy books. And I never even looked at the titles. They're just sort of things in the background. Unlike these, I hope you look at the titles if you can, because there's some good stuff there. But yeah, the Lydia, the fairy books. And then I noticed one, and it was about a jazz dancing fairy. And then there was a hedgehog fairy, and a snow swan fairy, and a gardening fairy, and a reading fairy. And I thought, these are weirder than I thought. And so I read the blurbs of them all. You know what? It's the same blurb. There's 240 books. They all have the exact same plot. You get a fairy, they represent something, and then the evil Jack Frost comes along and steals an object that the fairy has. In this case, it's a badge. And then that affects the real world in some way. So in the one I read, Lydia the Reading Fairy, people don't enjoy reading anymore. And so our two heroines come from the real world into the fairy world, and they sneak about, and they get the badge back off Jack Frost. And yeah, as I say, there's 240 of them. They all have the same plot. They're written by 4 authors who together go under the name Daisy Meadows. And I just found it fascinating, to be honest, that this book that was not quite a book, it was just sort of an assembly line product and a book. A bit like those Badger on the Barges, if you remember them. There was no Lucy Dan. That was all just a bunch of writers. I'm guessing Beast Quest are the same, if you know Beast Quest. But it was quite an entertaining little book, and they had fun little tricks. And I really liked Jack Frost, the villain. He was a sort of pompous blowhard who had written his biography but couldn't get anyone to read it. So he had the magic reading badge so that people would enjoy his biography. I liked it. I might pick up some more just to see what else they do with this exact same plot. And that was a nice little refresher after the God book. So then it brought us to our third book, and our third book was Monday Morning by Patrick Hamilton. It is autumn. That's why it's so grim and dark, and why I'm so grim. Actually, I'm just grim because I'm grim today. But the thing about autumn is perfect time to read a Patrick Hamilton. He's really autumnal. This is his very first book. He wrote it when he was 19. And the 3 Patrick Hamilton books I had yet to read were all ones written before he was in a car accident where he had his nose ripped off and his face disfigured. And apparently the books after the car accident are much grimmer than the ones before it. And on the face of it, his very first book when he was only 19, is a very positive kind of thing. It's a study in naivety. You got this main character, he's very, very naive, Anthony. And he's setting out into the world for the first time. He's finding first loves, he's getting his first jobs, and things like that. And he's really, really, really naive. He has these things that he calls a think. And when he has a think, which he has before bedtime, it's essentially daydreaming, and it's really childish daydreaming. He has so little life experience that he can't properly imagine what life should be. So when things happen to him, he doesn't really know how to react, because he imagines how he would react if he was in a film or a story, but he doesn't actually know how to react in real life because he's got no experience. Also, he wants to be a novelist. He wants to be a novelist because he knows poetry doesn't pay off. Look around you. Novelising doesn't pay off either. But, as well as that, he never conceives of the book in terms of story or anything like that. He always conceives of it in terms of a physical object. when he writes a book. What he imagines is a thing with a cover and pages and words. He doesn't actually think of what might go in the book at any point. And the reason it's called Monday Morning is because he's always promising to start his life next Monday. And that's about it. And that's why this is oddly depressing. Because you get to the end and he kind of gets the girl. Well, he does get the girl and they walk off. And they see some drunk people and he promises her, that's nothing compared to what I'll be like. And then that's the end of the book. And that's a pretty grim sort of... He's promising drunkenness. Especially compared to where Patrick Hamilton did go, where he spent World War II drinking, was it 4 bottles of black market brandy a week or something? Drunkenness is on the cards for this author, even though he wasn't particularly an alcoholic yet. But also, he still hasn't learned anything. This book stops, but it doesn't end because it could just keep going on. Because he could say, oh, next Monday morning I'll start my life. Next Monday morning I'll start my life. He's never going to learn. And so it's actually quite a sad book. Though in some ways I can sympathise because I'm a bit of a procrastinator. But not like that. I'm sure I learned some lessons sometimes. So yes, that was that. Next was another Patrick Hamilton, Craven House, published when he was 21. And I think I must have left this book on a shelf for too long because Will Self has an introduction in which none of the introduction makes any sense or has any point or adds to the book at all. Why do they keep hiring him? But Craven House, it's a really good book. It's better than Monday Morning. Monday Morning's, I'd say, it's sort of naive and fun, and there's this lingering, he's not going to do any better in life, is he? Underneath. This has, 1, a genuinely happy ending, and 2, some wonderful characters. So Craven House is a boarding house, of course. It's run by Mrs. Hat, who is part of a threesome, really. They're not a sexual threesome, because, to be honest, the couple aren't sexual either. So there's Mrs. Hat and Mr. and Mrs. Spicer, and they've always knocked about together. And they come as a unit. And they lease this boarding house out, and there are 2 sort of groups. There's the Brigadier and his son, and they have a great relationship. And then there's Elsie and her mother. And the reason I said Elsie and her mother is I've forgotten what Elsie's surname is. What her mother's called. Nixon. Mrs. Nixon and Elsie. And they have a terrible relationship. In fact, Elsie is terrified of her mother and terrified of the stick. And so for the first chunk, it's about them when they... before the war, it's about the 2 children. One of them's going to school. The boy's going to school. The girl is sort of repressed at home, scared of her stick. And Mr. Spicer, he likes to go out for long walks where he comes back drunk. And there was even a scene where it looked like he was going to start picking up sailors because he's sitting there drinking, and this sailor comes up to him and goes, "Hi mate, you lonely?" And he's like, "Yeah, do you want to join me for a drink?" "Yeah." But then they just chat about how the world's not as good as it used to be. But I was really sure for a bit they're going to go in for some sort of rough trade picking up sailor stuff, but no, they don't. Bit of a shame actually, because that would have been quite for 1926. That would have been rather shocking, but still, it's not a shocking book. It's actually quite a lovely book. So we have all this stuff of them and the tensions and awkward conversations. Patrick Hamilton is the king of recording an awkward conversation, and in Mr. Spicer he has his first bore. He's really good at writing very dull people who tell you about all their opinions. Right, so yes, very good book. Then you have the World War I part, which is very, very short, and then post-war, where things kind of collapse, society collapses, and Elsie stands up to her mother, and the servants stand up to the owner, and Mrs. Hat has a go at everybody because she hates them living in their house now. Go away, don't want you here. And Mrs. Spicer finds out that Mr. Spicer has been going to the cinema with a random woman from Camden and punches him in the face, in which he politely asks her to stop. And then they all leave, and then it has a happy ending, and it was really sweet and really lovely. Patrick Hamilton, start with Slaves of Solitude, because that's his best book. Then I would say 20,000 Streets Under the Sky, then Hangover Square, But after those three, I'd go with this one. I've got one more to go, but yeah, this was really good. So yeah, autumnal. We're going with autumnal. My last book of the month of September. Book number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 was Melmoth the Wanderer. It's about, I'd say it's about Melmoth the Wanderer, but it's not really. He's not in it for quite a while. So you got this guy called Melmoth. He has an uncle called Melmoth, and he goes to the uncle, and the uncle's a miser, and the house is all manky, and there's this portrait, and it has spooky, creepy eyes. And then as the uncle dies, the young Melmoth sees the figure with the spooky, creepy eyes, but he should be around because the portrait is dated for the 17th century, but it's now the 19th century. And he's fascinated. He picks up a letter, and he reads this letter in which he hears about this man called Stanton who went to Spain and saw some creepy things with this person with creepy eyes called Melmoth. And he was doing creepy things. And then there's a big storm, and it's a really good storm. My second favourite storm, probably in literature, except for David Copperfield, I would say. And he goes out to storm, and he tries to save people, but no one can, because there's a ship getting washed about in the storm. And then there's a man with creepy eyes who's laughing maniacally, which he does a lot, actually. But then they find this Spanish guy. They go, "Hey, Spanish guy, you washed up on this shore. Tell us your story." Which he does for about 400 pages. Oh, okay. So, stories. In fact, not only stories and stories in stories. At one point, there's a story in 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 a story. This book is trying to get you lost. It's a labyrinth. It's trying to shake the reader off as it's going, and it creates a sort of murky, unsure quality to it, which is unnerving, and unsettling. So the Spanish guy is a monk. He didn't want to be a monk. He got forced into it. There's 150 pages of him about being forced into being a monk, and sort of tortured by monks, teased by monks, wound up by monks. The monks just irritate him, really. They just get on his nerves and drive him mad. And he tries to escape, and it doesn't really go very well. And then he runs off and he lives with a Jewish man, and it's not as anti-Semitic, gets you fear for a bit, and the Jewish man has some stories, and then he runs off to another Jewish man, and then that Jewish man has skeletons. Some of the skeletons we don't find out who they are, even though he promises us we will, because this book was going to be longer, but the publisher was like, "Get it out now, we need to get it moving." Which is good, because it's 600 pages long, and a little too long for me as it is. But we find out about story in the story in the story, find out about Emily. And Emily is a young Spanish woman. I don't know why I think Spanish in this, despite the fact it's their first set in Ireland. But she's washed up on an island in India, and she raises herself with nature. And she's at one with nature. And she's very natural and lovely. And then this man with creepy eyes comes. And he tells her about what a horrible world the real world is. And she falls in love with him for it, because he gives her knowledge that she wouldn't have had otherwise. And this creepy man is Melmoth. The eye man is Melmoth. And this is the longest we spend with Melmoth. Now, beforehand, he was a very frightening figure. Now he's just a whiny emo. Or emu. A whiny emu. He's a whiny emu. Beforehand he was, ooh, strange, otherworldly, freaky eyes. People die when he's around. He can appear anywhere. Now he's like, I sold my soul to the devil, and it turns out it's not very nice. And you're like, haven't you read Faust? Of course. I mean, at least Faust enjoys himself before he gets damned to hell. He gets to fuck around with the Pope and have sex with Helena of Troy. This guy doesn't even enjoy himself. He just goes around to prisons and madhouses and miserable places going, you're all stupid because you're just sheeple and you follow religion, and by the way, I don't believe in all that, except I've sold my soul to the devil, so I suppose I must have believed in it, and I don't really like it, I've got 150-year lifespan and magic powers, but I don't want it. Do you want to swap? It turns out no one wants to swap. And that's Melmoth the Wanderer. There were some really great bits. There was this marriage on the island in the storm. In fact, a lot of the stormy bits were really good. The whole monk thing was really good, where the monk was teased by other monks for page on page on page. That was really good. And actually, Emily was really good, because she's this natural person. He's kind of corrupted her. And then there's sort of a hard cut, and she's now in Spain, and her family have found her, and she's trying to be a good Spanish daughter, and it's so against her self-raised upbringing and what she's used to on this island that she finds it really, really difficult, and she ends up running off with Melmoth, and there's a fencing match and a duel, and people die. And it's really good, that part. We needed, oddly, I started this with there's not a lot of Melmoth. We actually needed less Melmoth to make this book better, because when we get in his head, it turns out he's a whiny ass bitch. So yeah, keep him creepy. I'm going to read another take on Melmoth next month. I'm going to read the Sarah Perry one. She wrote the Serpent, Essex Serpent, which I thought was at times overly showily written, but oddly compelling nonetheless. So I'll be interested to see what she does with that. Also next month I'm going to read another Patrick Hamilton. I'm reading Mary Wollstonecraft's Letters from Sweden and other Scandinavian places at the moment, which is wonderful. That's for the book group. And I'm also going to read a biography of Christopher Smart's cat Geoffrey next month. So yeah, I've got some plans. I also have a snotty nose, as you probably can tell. I had a cold about 2 weeks ago. This snot won't go. Be gone, snot. I'm in a weird mood today. Right, have a lovely time, everybody. Goodbye.
You know my wandering days are